As I was reading the materials that were provided to me before the conference and also listening to these talks, I was reminded of a time in Beijing about 11 years ago when I was there with my husband, who is Chinese, and our then infant son. And we got into an elevator in the Beijing housing complex where we lived. And a man got in with us. And of course, he immediately looked at our baby and he admired our baby. And he said, oh, his skin is so white and his eyes are so big. And of course, he's so smart because mixed blood babies are all so smarter than the rest of us. And then he looked at my husband and he gave him a congratulatory nod and he said, now that's using foreign things to serve China. So, using foreign things to serve China is an old expression. It probably dates back to, I don't know, the end of the Qing dynasty, beginning of the 20th century. It became especially popular in the Mao era. And it can even be seen as an updated Maoist version of this saying, Chinese learning for the essence, Western learning for the application, which Professor Shen referenced in the copy of the paper that I read. Mao actually disagreed with this old formulation because he said that learning means fundamental theory and that fundamental theory should be the same in any country. However, so he, in his 1956 talk to music workers, he put his view bluntly. He said, we learn foreign things because we want to study and develop Chinese things. He's very clear on that. So it's a phrase that you'll read in any history of modern China, and I'd seen it a number of times. But it was only in the elevator when hearing my husband congratulate on using a foreign thing, being me, to serve China, that I understood how deeply the idea had been absorbed into contemporary Chinese culture. But if the concept of using foreign things to serve China is an old one, I would argue that the way in which foreign things are being used is changing. And here I agree with what I think was one of Professor Shen's points in his paper, that privileged young Chinese are interested in the US and in Obama as its representative, largely for pragmatic purposes nowadays. If you talk to young people, it's, the US presents the opportunity of a good education, a passport that doesn't require visas for interesting tourist destinations, clean air, lower taxes on luxury goods, etc., rather than any values that President Obama embodies or any particular American values. I think it's intriguing to consider how perceptions have changed by looking back on the role of African Americans in China, which Professor Fraser gave us such a fantastic overview of. I go back even a little further. If you look in 1907, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is not an African American work, but it's by Harriet Beecher Stowe about African American culture and their situation in the US. It became the first modern drama produced by Chinese people, produced and performed by Chinese people. It was done in Tokyo, and then it was brought back to Shanghai later this same year, and it played a really critical role in the development of modern drama in China, but also in the perceptions of African Americans. The dramatist Cao Yu, whose picture we saw earlier, said that it was not a random choice to perform Uncle Tom's Cabin, but we were sincerely sympathetic because we knew by bitter experience the sufferings and humiliations of an oppressed race. Lu Xun, the great Chinese writer, read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it had a big influence on him because he said it showed him how hard the Chinese had to work not to become slaves themselves. Excuse me. In 1940, we had the great overview already. In 1940, Paul Robeson did the version of March of the Volunteers. As Professor Fraser said, he wanted to go to China, but he was never able to. But he became very popular. He telegraphed Mao Zedong after the founding of the PRC to congratulate him. And one of the reasons the song Old Man River is so popular in China, a lot of Chinese people still know that song, is because Paul Robeson sang it in Showboat. But some African Americans did get to China, like Robert and Mabel Williams, about whom Professor Fraser has written a fascinating article and also discusses in the book. They were guests of the Chinese government, and they were there in the Cultural Revolution, including in 1968 when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And they apparently encouraged Mao to make the statement in which he said, a very famous statement, the Afro-American struggle is not only a struggle waged by the exploited and oppressed black people for freedom and emancipation, it's a clarion call to all the exploited and oppressed people of the US to fight against the barbarous rule of the monopoly capitalist class. It's a tremendous aid and inspiration to the struggle of the people throughout the world against US imperialism. But as we all know, the world has changed, and the way in which foreign things are perceived as useful by China is changing. In his paper, Professor Shen calls it the triumph of nationalism and the China model, and I think this is largely correct. On an official level, China is considerably less interested in learning foreign things to study and develop Chinese things, largely because it has done such a good job of learning and absorbing what it has deemed useful over the past century. Now it wants to reverse the tide and get the rest of the world to use Chinese things to study and develop foreign things. You see, Uncle Tom's Cabin played such a landmark role in Chinese dramatic history, but now China wants to export its own dramas and other performances. It wants grand opera performed in Chinese in New York. It wants Chinese musicals on Broadway, and its plans about Hollywood I think we get to hear about next. China doesn't need African Americans to help dramatize its fight against imperialism. Nowadays, China itself is the biggest foreign investor in many African countries, and its own behaviors is what some observers call imperialist. In June of this year, The New Yorker ran an article called China and Africa, the New Imperialists. The Telegraph ran a story called Why China is Trying to Colonize Africa. And like virtually everything else these days, the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C. was actually made in China by the sculptor Lei Yixin. It was carved with Chinese granite in Hunan province, Mao Zedong's hometown, in Changsha. It was shipped to Baltimore, and it was reassembled in Washington by 10 Chinese stonemasons. In the 1956 speech I quoted, the Talk to Music Workers, Mao said, "We must master both Chinese and foreign things and combine them into an organic whole. If you grasp this basic policy, your work will have a great future." I would argue that this has largely been done, whether or not to our liking. One of the many things it means is that the special role of African Americans in China and of foreigners in general is over. Thank you very much.